Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Now, it's Women's Month still, and we continue profiling prominent women who are making big strides in their fields. This morning, we're joined by Bulelwa Mabasa. She is a lawyer, author and presidential advisor on land reform. She's back with another book, My Land Obsession. In it, she details how her grandparents endured land dispossession and how that framed her passion for land reform. She joins me now virtually to discuss the matters with us. Bulelwa, thank you very much for speaking to us here on eNCA. Firstly, you worked or still work for one of the biggest or most famous law firms in the country, Waxmans, and of course you were on the Center of Land Reform, right, at that particular law firm. Exactly what would your day-to-day job entail then, if you're looking literally at land reform in this South Africa?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I think, firstly, I must state that I was always in full-time law practice as an attorney at Worksman's Attorneys. I have been at Worksman's Attorneys now for 20 years and a half. I've doubled my age since I've been at the firm, but as you will probably imagine, that a law firm practice, an attorney's practice, is highly busy. It's stressed, it's deadlines, it's particularly in litigation. So when I was approached to form part of the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform, I was still in full-time practice. So what had happened was I needed to divide my time for that 18 months where I was doing land reform panel work, and I was still in full-time attorney's practice. So one day I'm at the Nation buildings, and then at night I'm consulting with clients. And so it got to a point where there was a blurring of lines between night and day, and working in bed, working, while I'm cooking, and that sort of thing. So it was a blur of many boundaries and in many kind of different respects. And of course, being a mother of young children as well, that was a major challenge. And obviously, COVID also added an extra layer of a challenge, with children having to study from home, having to work from home during that time. So it was a beautiful storm that ultimately landed up there in my first publication of Land in South Africa, Nation Formation and Contested Meanings. And at the heels of having published that publication, then I started writing My Land Obsession at the end of, I think it was December 2020, if I'm not mistaken.
All
so
right.
You can imagine I had just no gap to that was there for me to just fill. I feel like my life was always kind of yeah.
All right, so what are your views then on this big question? You know, it's an elephant in the room wherever you are, whether in Parliament or just sitting with friends at a braai. The land question. What are your views then? The stuff that you would advise when you were still part of that Presidential Advisory Panel on how this should be addressed?
So that's, my views are obviously part of the Presidential Advisory Land Reform Panel report, but mainly in My Land Obsession, what I do, I kind of place the land question in its basic form. I take it out of Parliament, courts, laws, into a personal story. And my views really are that, firstly, the land question is important not because of its financial or productive value. It's important because that's where we locate our sense of belonging. That's where we locate our heritage. That's where we run our cultural practices. That's where we grow food, and that's where we that's where we know who we are. It's part of identity. But most importantly, when it comes to policy, what I do say is that we need to frame the land reform question away from it just being about people wanting to farm or just about agriculture, but to start to think about solutions around urban need, the urban density question. What are we going to do about providing land and buildings and how are we going to do that to people that are currently landless, that need land for other purposes, for residential purposes, for business purposes, for industrial purposes even. But I think also one of the big arguments that I brought to the table in the panel and even now is to have a solution for our dual tenure system where Black people that live in rural areas and in informal settlements in urban areas do not have legal title that is legally recognizable. So we've had some court judgments that have come up from the Pietermaritzburg courts that tell us that the policy and the state has to start to recognize land rights for people that also live on land that has never been surveyed. So it's a whole lot of other recommendations that come from my land obsession, but they are all grounded on my personal experience, having grown up in Meadowlands, in a township, having had access to a rural life where my mother and my grandfather came from. So it's really, for me, the message that says land reform should stop being an elephant in the room. I believe that it's something that can actually build our nation, and that if we do not resolve the land question, we cannot truly have a united country, and we cannot truly achieve our potential as South Africa and as South Africans. So I think you should take a moment and maybe read for yourself and let me know what your views are so we can engage on them. But those are some of the recommendations and issues that I really felt strongly about that emerged from my land obsession.
Well, look, I read a synopsis of your book because I'm going to actually ask you to send it to me, or at least ask Picador Africa to send me a copy so that I can read it. I recognized in the synopsis that you and I have a lot in common, like a lot in common. You grew up Christian, grandparents, that was exactly me, born to a young mother, grew up in Soweto, but also this part where you say Mawe and Tata's dreams of a bright future were shattered when apartheid policemen one day descended in Caspers, demolishing houses and seizing personal belongings, forcibly removing them and their children from their homes to a makeshift area a few hundred meters from a graveyard. This reminds me of the stories my grandmother would tell me, for instance, about what happened to them when she still lived in Sophia Town. So I just want to know from you, obviously the government then was creating laws, whether in parliament and passing acts and legislature, to be able to do such things, to people that they wanted to take land from. So during those times that was legal according to what they had passed. So is there anything that we can do today, that our government can do today, to pass certain laws that will allow people to be able to own land? In fact, that's such an important question, Maseko, because that's why I chose to study law in the first place. I realized how powerful the law is in creating a certain narrative or reshaping society. And in my case, part of the recommendations I had made, for example, was to say, why do we not have a redistribution act that is contemplated in the Constitution that tells us how people must get land, who must get land, and what is the process that could be transparent where people are getting land and for what purpose. I'll also say then that some of the legislation that was passed after freedom, the post-1994 legislation, in a way continues to promote this duality where Black people in rural areas don't have title deeds. They don't have, long leases. They're not recognized in the deed registry. And I said, as part of the Presidential Advisory Panel report, that there needs to be a rethink on how South Africa's tenure system could become a unitary system that recognizes everyone's land rights, regardless of whether you're in a rural area or in a township or in an informal settlement. So you are absolutely correct that Parliament has not done enough to ensure that the level of protection when it comes to land rights is certain, that it is strong enough and resilient. So that's precisely what I've also said in my land obsession,
when I take the reader through some of the cases that I've actually handled in my practice, where I have made when I have called for some of these laws to be introduced and some of them to be scrapped, either because they are archaic or also because they promote this apartheid norm of separation in terms of based on where people live and based on their race.
And I think it's quite important. I'll wait for you to send me that copy, and then maybe I can have you in studio next time for a much longer conversation about exactly,
I would love to.
Yeah, and maybe we can add a third person in the debates just to find out what people think about this thing that's still an elephant in the room. Thank you very much, Bulelwa, for speaking to us here on eNCA. That was lawyer, author, and presidential advisor on land reform, Bulelwa Mabasa.